Hello and welcome to our discussion of moral pluralism. Moral pluralism is a theory unlike what we've seen so far in the semester. In this unit, we'll go through and we'll talk about our theory of the right, and then we'll focus in our second lecture much more on the decision-making procedure involved with this theory. The structure of the theory is pretty basic. Our theory of the right is going to involve what we call basic prima facie duties. Our theory of the good is going to actually be pretty varied. We're going to see how there's a pretty major difference between what we've seen so far in this theory. The items that we consider to be intrinsically worthy in this model of ethics include virtue, pleasure related to virtue, and knowledge. And then our consideration of moral worth is also going to be more complex. It's going to involve conceptions involving duty, the motive of duty, that are desired to produce good and to produce real pleasure and prevent pain. Now, thus far, what we've seen in the semester is moral monism. That is, we've seen theories that basically state that there is one particular feature or principle of action or right or wrong, or good, that is, that determines the deontic status of the action, whether or not the action is right or wrong. Well, ultimately, real life seems to be much more complicated than these other forms of ethics give credit for. And that's something that we've noticed so far, is that ultimately, for example, with Kant, if we're saying that the rightness or wrongness of an action is based on respect for humanity or whether it passes some type of idea about willing, well, ultimately, reality seems to be a lot more complex than that. When we consider things such as utilitarianism, we want to say that the consequences of an action are important, but ultimately that there's a lot more that goes to it. Maybe perhaps reasons why we've done something, whether the action itself is good, things along those lines. So if real life is really complicated, why shouldn't ethics be more complicated? Why shouldn't it be more flexible? Well, that brings us to the idea of moral pluralism. If we accept a view of plural morality, this gives us a lot of different features. First, it tells us that there are numerous equally relevant moral features in moral dilemmas. If that's the case, then we may be able to say that there are a number of reasons to do something, or to evaluate a certain dilemma in various ways. We may also be able to say that there's a plurality of moral principles. This is vastly different than we've seen so far, in which we've seen models of ethics that focus simply on one principle, whether it's the principle of utility, principle of the categorical imperative, whatever it may be. Also, we're going to state that there's no underlying or supreme moral principle that justifies plurality. That's pretty important, because if we're saying that there is no supreme principle, then we're going to be looking at a variety of different moral considerations. If we accept plurality, obviously we're going to have to deal with conflict between moral principles. And it's important for us to figure out how we may be able to look at these in order to understand how to move forward. Well, one thing that we could do is we could go through a lexical moral pluralism. That is, we could state that there are certain rankings of principles based in terms of their relative importance. So, for example, let's say that I'm going to say that principle 1 matters here, principle 2 matters, principle 3, principle 4, and I rank them according to this importance. Well, this may not work out too well for us. Prioritizing doesn't ultimately seem to make sense when we look at real situations. So if prioritizing based on this doesn't work, doesn't account for reality, then we know that lexically trying to order them isn't going to make sense for us either. So instead of lexical moral pluralism, we need to look for something else. Well, when we do that, we need to make certain that we're dealing with two issues that come up. The first is the problem of consistency. How do we organize or formulate rules that allow us to avoid contradictions? If I can't go through and lexically put these together, then I need to make certain that I find something that is going to be consistent between various cases. We also have the problem of adjudication. That is, how do we choose amongst rules when conflict appears to form justified verdicts of right and wrong? Well, if we're going to try to adjudicate our choices, and if we're going to try to come up with consistency, we need to figure out how to do so. And according to W.D. Ross, who is one of perhaps maybe the most vocal proponent of this form of ethics, we should discuss prima facie duties. A prima facie duty is pretty basic in essence. The prima facie duty has two characteristics. First, it has some type of morally relevant feature that counts in favor of doing. That is, that the duty has something important about it that says we should do it. And second, we have to consider that feature, if it were the only morally relevant feature of the situation, that it would then become our duty proper. That is, it would be something that we're morally required to do. Timmons writes, to explain this notion, let us consider a very familiar sort of situation that does not involve having to make a moral decision. Suppose that you want very much to spend this evening with a certain friend, someone you are quite fond of. Your friend is dead set on going to see a particular film this evening, and in fact has invited you to go. So given your desire to spend time with her, you have a reason for going to the film in question. Moreover, if there are no other considerations that affect your choice, then not only do you have a reason to go to the film with your friend, you have a sufficient, all things considered, reason to go. However, suppose things are more complicated and it turns out that the film is one that you have recently seen and did not like, and you are quite sure that you would dislike having to sit through it again. So you clearly have some reason for not going to the film with your friend. Since you have some reason for going and some reason for not going, you have to decide what to do by balancing your competing reasons. In balancing these competing reasons, you're trying to decide which of them is, in this situation at least, most important. Suppose that you decide that spending time with your friend is more important than in the situation than avoiding the film. All things considered, you decide you should go. Well, Ross ends up telling us that there are 7 prima facie duties. Now, before we go a little deeper into those 7 prima facie duties, one thing that's important to discuss is what the term prima facie means. Prima facie typically means at first glance. Unfortunately, Ross isn't using it in that way. Ross is telling us that some action is a prima facie duty if it does in fact possess some morally relevant feature that counts in favor of doing the action. So it's not just a surface level examination. It is something that is going to ultimately be more complex. According to Timmons, thus to classify an action as a prima facie duty is to zero in on one aspect or feature of the action that has bearing on its rightness or wrongness. And that ends up leading us to our duty proper. Ross tells us that there are 7 basic prima facie duties. These include the duties of fidelity, which involve promises, being truthful, avoiding lies or deception. Duties of reparation, making amends for past wrong acts. Duties of gratitude, which involve paying back people who helped us. Duties of justice. Now, notice here that this is justice in the sense of social justice. The distribution of benefits per merit. This is not about retributive justice. Duties of beneficence, helping others improve their character or intelligence, increasing their pleasure or reducing pain. Duties of self-improvement, improving our character or intelligence. And duties of non-malfeasance, that is, avoiding injury to others. So based on this, we can develop a theory of the right here. We know that actions have prima facie right-making and wrong-making features, and that our actual duty, or our duty proper, depends on all these features. We look at and compare alternative actions we can perform in the situation. Now, when we come across this kind of a conflict, we have to evaluate the stringency of the duties based on the situation. Now, it's important to note here that when we say that we have a reason to do something different than another prima facie duty that may be present, that is when we choose one over the other, it's important to note that we don't cancel out these duties. These duties, in fact, actually may end up generating new things. Our choices might. So an example. Let's assume that I have made an appointment to meet with you to discuss moral pluralism, and that this is an important thing. We've set this up for, say, a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to go meet with you, and as I'm going to campus, I come across a car accident. Now, given where this car accident is and the particular route that I take to campus, right now I am the only person who may be able to directly intervene. So I have now a duty to you. After all, I've made a promise to you that I'm going to meet with you. But perhaps I also have a duty of beneficence. I have a duty perhaps to step in to help this person who appears to be injured in the accident. Now, if I look at the situation and look at the stringency, it may be more important for me to take a step now to assist the person who's in need, who's in really urgent medical need, for example. That may be more stringent than my duty to meet with you. Now, that doesn't mean that I have an excuse necessarily not to meet with you. If I'm going to perform this action to help this person, and that involves me not being able to ultimately meet with you to help you with this class, then I have a duty that comes out of this, a duty of reparation. That is, maybe I then need to make an amends to you, maybe schedule another time or something along those lines, to apologize, for example. So we can see that duties may roll into other duties, according to this theory. So we may be able to say that we can avoid the consistency problem because moral rules are not exceptionless in that situation. Features about the situation we find ourselves in may help us override rules, and therefore we create consistency. But notice here that we've yet to talk about how we actually solve moral conflict. We'll come to that in our next lecture. But we do get to this idea now where we can generate a theory in a nutshell. We can say that an action is right if and only if one has a prima facie duty to do the action that is more stringent than any other conflicting prima facie duty that may be present. And our theory of the good, which we'll explore in our next lecture, states that there are 4 basic intrinsic goods: virtue, pleasure, the state consisting of pleasure in proportion to virtue, and knowledge.